Act 2, Scene 3 opens with the sound of knocking at the castle's gate. A continuation of the knocking that has persistently punctuated the last 20 lines of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's dialogue in the previous scene. The porter is roused from his drunken sleep to open up to let the visitors in, talking as he goes. He imagines that if he were the porter of Hellgate, i.e. the entrance to hell, whose job it is to admit the sinners there, he should have old turning of the key, or would be kept very busy indeed. And he describes, for the entertainment of the audience, 3 imaginary characters in need of his services. A farmer who has committed suicide, a mortal sin, a dishonest tailor, and an equivocator. Faith, here's an equivocator that could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. Oh, come in, equivocator. The verb to equivocate, which means to use ambiguous language so as to conceal the truth or to avoid committing oneself, would have had much more resonance for the Jacobean audience than it does today. It's important to note that equivocation is not the same as lying, although contemporary Protestants would have disagreed. Don't forget that we have already met master equivocators in the form of the witches, who have used ambiguous language, which is truthful in its essence, to deceive Macbeth and tempt him to awaken his murderous ambition. The contemporary audience would have been well aware that the porter is alluding to the Jesuit or Catholic priest Father Garnet, who was executed in 1606, the year of the play's first performance, for his alleged complicity in the Gunpowder Plot, a failed assassination attempt against the Protestant James I by English Catholics, led by Robert Catesby. The Jesuits used equivocation when interrogated so that they could tell the truth in such a way that they kept secrets from those they felt were not entitled to know them, i.e. the Protestant authorities, but would nonetheless keep their consciences clear. Jesuits would therefore equivocate to protect themselves or others without committing the sin, in their eyes, of actually lying. Protestants, however, believed that the Jesuit doctrine of equivocation was merely a justification for deceit, and so it did little to keep priests, such as Father Garnet, from the executioner. Shakespeare has already linked equivocation with the infernal forces of the witches, his way of demonising the Jesuits and currying favour with the Protestant James I. The scales in this image probably refer to the metaphorical scales of justice, which weigh the evidence for the prosecution on one side against the evidence for the defence on the other, and allude to how Father Garnet used doublespeak in an attempt to give testimony neither for nor against the accused. The porter's, and therefore Shakespeare's, contempt for equivocators is clear, as he declares that Father Garnet yet could not equivocate to heaven, suggesting that God is a Protestant God and is not to be hoodwinked by such manipulation of language. The fact that the equivocator is knocking on the Hellgate not only implies the inherent evil in the practice, but also creates a moment of dramatic irony, where the porter is completely unaware of the murder of the king and, therefore, of the significance of his words, as understood by the audience, that the castle has become a place where the devil, in the shape of the Macbeths, is in residence. This image will also remind us to observe closely Macbeth's language to detect his own attempts at equivocation in the action that follows. Macduff and Lennox are finally admitted and engage in some vulgar banter with the porter, who is angling for a tip. The role of the porter would have been played by the theatrical company's comic actor, and Shakespeare uses the moment of light relief that ensues in order to create a break in the dramatic tension which we have experienced in the previous scene, with the murder of Duncan, and the inevitable drama and tension that we will experience when the crime is discovered. In practical stage management terms, it also allows the actor who is playing Macbeth to change clothes and wash the fake blood from his hands. The porter excuses the fact that the castle is still asleep by informing the two gentlemen that we were carousing till the second cock, or until the cock crowed for the second time at about 3 a.m, and that drink, sir, is a great provoker of 3 things, namely nose painting, or making the nose red, sleep, and urine. Lechery, or sex, he goes on to say, it provokes and unprovokes. It provokes the desire, but it takes away the performance. In other words, alcohol arouses the desire for sexual intercourse, but takes away the ability to perform it. He then goes on to present them with a riddle which reintroduces the theme of equivocation. Therefore, much drink may be said to be an equivocator with lechery. It makes him, and it mars him. It sets him on, and it takes him off. It persuades him, and disheartens him. Makes him stand to, and not stand to. In conclusion, equivocates him in a sleep. In other words, it only fulfills his sexual desire in a dream, and giving him the lie, leaves him. The porter concludes his part by joking that he has been too strong for the alcohol that he has drunk, even though he took up my legs some time, or prevented him from walking, yet I made a shift to cast him. In other words, he's managed to get rid of him by vomiting him up. Note how the porter speaks in prose, signalling the lowly status of the character, as well as the base nature of the subject matter of his dialogue, while Macduff's own speech remains in blank verse. The porter's dramatic function complete, he exits as Macbeth enters. Macduff immediately asks him if the king is stirring or awakening. Note not only how Macbeth equivocates, not yet, but also how his speeches, up until the discovery of the body, are clipped and short. The suspense is clearly playing havoc with his nerves. Macduff is concerned that he is late. He did command me to call timely on him. I have almost slipped the hour. Macbeth tells him that he will take him to him, and they exchange some niceties on the way to the door. Macbeth once more making a false show of his loyalty to the king, assuring Macduff that the labour we delight in physics pain. In other words, work that we take pleasure in is a medicine in itself against any pain that we may experience while doing it. While Macduff is off stage making the gruesome discovery, Lennox engages Macbeth in small talk. He asks him, "Goes the king hence today?" And Macbeth equivocates in response. His answer, "He does, he did appoint so," is not strictly a lie, as his corpse will certainly be leaving that very day. Lennox then goes on to tell Macbeth that it has been an unruly or unsettled night. Where we lay, our chimneys were blown down, and, as they say, lamentings heard in the air, strange screams of death, and prophesying with accents terrible of dire combustion and confused events, new hatched to the woeful time. The obscure bird clamoured the livelong night. Some say the earth was feverous and did shake. Lennox's account of freak winds that have destroyed parts of buildings, and the sounds of supernatural screaming foretelling even more burning and chaos in this time of war, with the owl, considered a bird of ill omen, calling throughout the night, and a personified earth, which was sick, being feverish and trembling, merely elicit in Macbeth the somewhat laconic and equivocal, "'Twas a rough night." Yes, Macbeth has indeed had a rough night, but not in the way Lennox understands it to have been. This moment is heavy with dramatic irony. Lennox is ignorant of the full significance of the world seeming to have been turned upside down overnight, putting it down to the troubled times in which they live, what with Scotland's wars with Norway. The audience, however, is only too aware that this upheaval in the natural order has actually been caused by the murder of a king who, it was believed, had been appointed by divine right. Note that from now on, this scene will be one of chaos, with characters entering and exiting as all hell breaks loose. Macbeth and Lennox's interaction is abruptly interrupted by Macduff's entrance with the news that we've been waiting for. He is initially, however, unable to put into words the sight he has seen. "Oh, horror, horror, horror! Tongue nor heart cannot conceive, nor name thee." When pressed further by both Macbeth and Lennox to say what the matter is, Macduff uses a metaphor which relies heavily on religious imagery to convey the gravity of the situation. "Confusion now hath made his masterpiece. Most sacrilegious murder hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple, and stole thence the life of the building." Duncan would have been anointed, or smeared with holy oil, at his coronation, signifying that he had become God's deputy on earth. And the metaphor of him as the Lord's temple evokes this sense of him as a sacred entity that has been violated and desecrated. Macbeth and Lennox both appear incredulous at the news, responding only with short questions, although we know that Macbeth is, of course, being disingenuous. "What is't you say? The life? Mean you his majesty?" Macduff invites them to see for themselves if they don't believe him. "Approach the chamber and destroy your sight with a new Gorgon." A Gorgon was a creature from Greek mythology, the most famous of whom was Medusa, who, with snakes for hair, had the power to turn any man looking at her into stone. Macduff, with this metaphor, is suggesting that the sight of the murdered king is sufficiently terrible to have a similar effect. Macbeth and Lennox exit while Macduff attempts to rouse the rest of the household from their cosy slumber with his cries. "Awake, awake! Ring the alarm bell! Murder and treason! Banquo and Donalbain! Malcolm, awake! Shake off this downy sleep, death's counterfeit, and look on death itself." The language in the rest of this speech alludes to the Last Judgment, suggesting that, for him, the death of the king is the harbinger of the apocalypse, or the end of the world. The sight of the murdered king is the great doom's image, and he commands Malcolm, Banquo, as from your graves to rise up and walk like sprites, or ghosts, to countenance this horror, in much the same way as it is believed the Christian dead shall rise from their graves as ghosts on Judgment Day. Lady Macbeth enters, her language also inadvertently echoing this idea as she refers to a hideous trumpet that calls to parley the sleepers of the house. Macduff's words to her in response are deeply ironic, unaware as he is of her complicity in the murder. Not only does he address her as gentle lady, which couldn't be further from the truth, but he also says that "'tis not for you to hear what I can speak. The repetition in a woman's ear would murder as it fell. Even to hear it spoken of would, he is sure, be the death of her." Banquo enters and is similarly incredulous at the situation. "Too cruel anywhere. Dear Duff, I prithee contradict thyself and say it is not so." Macbeth and Lennox now return with Macbeth suitably shocked by what he has seen, and suddenly much more talkative. "Had I but died an hour before this chance, I had lived a blessed time, for from this instant there's nothing serious in mortality. All is but toys, renown and grace is dead. The wine of life is drawn, and the mere lees is left this vault to brag of." He laments that life has now become full of meaningless trivialities to him, and using a metaphor, likens the earth to a vault or wine cellar which has been emptied of its wine, to leave only the lees or dregs behind. Note how the length of Macbeth's speeches has dramatically increased now that he is no longer in a state of fearful anticipation. The body has been discovered, and he is finally able to play the part of the grieving, loyal subject, whilst laying the groundwork for his own claim to the throne. Malcolm and Donalbain now enter, and Macbeth announces that the king, their father, has been slain. Note how, on the surface, the lords appear to accept the version of events that Macbeth needs them to for his plan to work. That those of his chamber, as it seemed, had done it. Their hands and faces were all badged with blood, so were their daggers which, unwiped, we found upon their pillows. Although their language does reveal a certain degree of scepticism. Note how Lennox uses the phrase, seemed had done it. And when Macbeth reveals, "Oh, yet I do repent me of my fury that I did kill them," note how Macduff immediately questions his motive for having done this. "Wherefore did you so?" Which suggests that Macbeth's actions are already not sitting quite right with him. Macbeth attempts to justify his actions in his lengthiest speech of the scene. He begins using a rhetorical device known as hypophora, where a rhetorical question is immediately supplied with its answer, by melodramatically asserting that he found it impossible to restrain himself. Who can be wise, amazed, temperate and furious, loyal and neutral in a moment? No man. Note the way he is now perhaps speaking too much rather than not enough to convince the men. His list of 6 contrasting adjectives here, suggesting insincere overacting on his part, rather than heartfelt grief. He argues that his emotions of violent love for his king got the better of his reason. He then launches into a graphic description of the body. Here lay Duncan, his silver skin laced with his golden blood, and his gashed stabs looked like a breach in nature for ruin's wasteful entrance. He describes the unconscious guards as steeped or dyed in the colours of their trade, i.e. in blood, with their daggers unmannily breeched, or rudely clothed in gore. Lady Macbeth interrupts Macbeth's diatribe with the exclamation, "Help me hence, ho!" as she faints, leaving us wondering if she is actually affected by Macbeth's graphic description of the deed, or if it is a stage-managed distraction to shut Macbeth up. Whatever it is, it works, as Macbeth stops talking and Macduff, rather than her husband, orders that she be looked to, or taken care of. Malcolm and Donalbain meanwhile talk privately to one another. Malcolm questions why they are not the ones to be speaking in such a manner as Macbeth, when they are the ones it affects the most. Why do we hold our tongues, that most may claim this argument for ours? Donalbain responds that there is nothing that can be said when they may be about to suffer a similar fate to their father. What should be spoken here, where our fate hid in an auger hole may rush and seize us? An auger is a sharp-pointed tool, and the way Donalbain suggests that their own fate may be currently hiding in a hole made by one evokes the stab wound suffered by their father. He urges them to leave, as they are not ready to grieve yet. "Let's away, our tears are not yet brewed." Banquo, meanwhile, suggests to the men as a whole that, once they have dressed, they should reconvene to question this most bloody piece of work, to know it further, and declares that he is ready to fight the undivulged pretence, or as yet unrevealed claim to the crown, which he regards as treasonous malice. Malcolm and Donalbain decide that they will not attend the meeting. They don't wish to consort with the men who they believe may be hypocritically showing an unfelt sorrow. Rather than stay, the pair decide to flee the castle. Malcolm to England and Donalbain to Ireland, as their separated fortune shall keep us both the safer. As Duncan's closest relatives, Donalbain suspects they are next in line. There's daggers in men's smiles. The nearer in blood, the nearer bloody. Malcolm agrees, asserting his belief that the killing has only just started. This murderous shaft that shot hath not yet lighted. In other words, the lethal arrow that has been shot has not yet found its target. They decide to leave immediately without taking leave of their host or of the other nobles. Malcolm, of course, has recently been named as the Prince of Cumberland, and so Duncan's heir. He should be crowned king as a matter of course, but his unwillingness to stand up for his birthright, however, will leave a power vacuum which Macbeth will be able to exploit. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques and English literature texts.